actually meet real people. Well, as John so very kindly said, I'm the curator of the John Moore Museum in Church Street, Tewkesbury, which is part of a row of properties owned by the Abbey Lawn Trust, a buildings preservation trust. And I don't know why it's gone blank. There we go. And the talk is called Restoring Tewkesbury's Past, the Work of the Abbey Lawn Trust. So it's going to take us up to the Queen's visit in 1971 and a bit beyond as well. So, there we go, 1410 to, oh no, yeah, 1410 to 1458, a medieval property speculation. So this is the row of buildings right by Tewkesbury Abbey. Originally, there were 25 of them. And it says at the top there, oak trees felled 1405 to 1408, houses built circa 1410. Because there's been a lot of debate over the years about just how old these buildings were. And it wasn't until 2015 that we actually found out exactly. Because we had the Oxford Dendrochronology Laboratory, they came and took core samples from number 39 there, and also further along number 45, which is now the Merchant's House. Dendrochronology, that's a talk in itself, but just briefly, just as a fingerprint will only match to one person, a pattern of 70 or more tree rings will only match one place in history and can tell you the exact year a tree was cut down. So core samples taken from 2 of our properties. Frame buildings are dated using this process, dendrochronology, by taking small pencil-like samples from the timber using an electric drill. The tree rings in the samples are measured under a microscope, and the pattern of wide-ranging and narrow rings match to one place in history. So thanks to the wonderful art of dendrochronology, we found that there were 2 felling dates for the timbers the houses were built of. That's a felling date of 1405 and another one of 1408. And because the timber is oak, seasoned oak is very hard to work with. So it's usually within a couple of years of a tree being felled that it's actually going to be put to use. So that gives us roughly a date for our buildings of around about 1409 to 1410. So thanks to dendrochronology, we now know that our buildings are an early example of a late medieval row of buildings. Illustration there showing carpenters at work. That's from 1578. But it shows you the whole idea of a timber-framed building. Interestingly, a lot of the timbers, when examined, they're not local timbers at all. They're from Shropshire, which I'll talk about. Close-up of the row as they are today. The Merchant's House, number 45 in the row, which has been restored now to give you an idea of what the houses would have been like originally. So, who built these houses? The location is really the clue, because this row of buildings were an early property speculation by the Benedictine monks of Tewkesbury Abbey. Timber-framed buildings. This illustration shows you what is now today the Merchant's House, and I don't know how much you know about timber-framed buildings, but basically they're an early example of prefabrication. A timber frame building is literally a series of wooden boxes, a series of wooden frames, all joined together. If your house is built of brick, your walls bear the weight of your building, support your building. If you have a timber framed house, it's the Merchant's House. And you can see there the whole idea of wooden boxes, wooden frames. So you've got the workshop there, one box. You've got the hall there, another box, shop at the front, bedroom upstairs. Interestingly, in the Merchant's House, the last part of the building, the workshop, was added on later. It doesn't date from 1410, it dates to about 1470. And it's classic timber frame buildings. This building's got some very interesting features. I particularly like the fact you've got a fire, but you haven't got a chimney. You've got a very interesting smoke void. In medieval times, you had a number of choices. You could just have a hole in the roof for smoke to exit. You could have that wonderful idea of a wooden chimney. It's hard to believe, but lots of medieval houses had wooden chimneys, and you won't be surprised to know what happened to a lot of medieval houses. Brick was probably your best option, but brick doesn't really become cheap until the early 17th century or so. So the other alternative was to have a smoke void or a smoke apron. So the smoke from the fire rises up there, finds its way out under the eaves, or out through the windows. Of course, the heat rising helps to warm your bedroom, but it also must have been quite a smoky environment. And we think possibly that when these houses were built, rather than using the fire for cooking, they might have actually had a communal cookhouse at the bottom of the gardens. There's no actual archaeological evidence of that, but it's quite a good theory. We move on. Anticipation. There we go. So that's one of the larger rows in the building. An interesting feature of them is you can just see there, you have these wooden shutters. Wooden shutters, and when the buildings were restored in the 1960s, 1970s, evidence was found of a shutter-cum-counter mechanism. So these wooden shutters not only protected your house, but they could be lowered out into the street to form a counter. So medieval Tudor shops, you didn't go around them, people bought and sold their goods into the street. So a pivoting shop counter that could also be a very useful shutter was a perfect solution. Much what the John Moore Museum building is like, other than we haven't got the workshop there. So note the very steep stairs. The stairs are more like ladders. Well, those in fact are ladders. The shops that we would have had, maybe in the row. We don't actually know who was actually carrying on their business there, but it's fair to surmise they would have been sort of small artisans, small shopkeepers who may be producing things on site and then selling them at the front. So that's an apothecary there from 1578. Note the little counter there out into the street. Maybe a shutter-cum-counter like ours. These are German woodcuts, but it shows the style of the shop, particularly that a bell maker. I'm not sure if there'd be any bell makers in our row of buildings, but it's got a nice picture. Shop from 1578 with goods being bought and sold out into the street. So yeah, they were early property speculation by the Benedictine Abbey, monks, Benedictine Abbey. Sold, rented out to merchants who'd have somewhere to trade, and of course they could make a living, and some of their rental would then go towards the abbey. I like to think this is just a pet theory of mine, that possibly some of them, the shops in the row, might have been functioning as maybe like a farm shop today, because the abbey, you know, and lots of land, had the vineyards at the back, it had all the cloth it produced, etc. So maybe some of them actually selling goods that the abbey had actually produced. Maybe they were the suppliers. Repetitive strain syndrome. So Shakespeare Abbey was dissolved in 1540, one of the last monastic foundations to be dissolved. And at the dissolution, we have this wonderfully entitled office, the Augmentation Office, for the administration of monastic properties and revenues confiscated by the Crown. And for Tewkesbury Abbey, the rent records rents being received from 25 tenements described as being against the monastery, standing in Church Street from the cemetery to Gander Lane. So it doesn't really, that's our row of buildings. So there's a good chance that if the Abbey were renting the buildings out in 1540, there's a very good chance that they were built by the Benedictine monks. So that's what we're basing our theory upon. I particularly like this picture. It looks that the dissolution seems quite a jolly process. You know, no one's being too upset. Obviously, it was very traumatic for everybody involved. The Augmentation Office also mentioned that in 1540, the parish priest of Tewkesbury occupied one of our cottages and was being paid £10 a year by the Crown, which interestingly is about the same as a skilled tradesman. And again, you can see in this rather colourful 18th century picture, you have a clergyman fleeing from hunting, shooting and fishing Henry VIII. There we go. 1558 to 1891, charitable purposes. Okay, so the Abbey was dissolved in 1540 and all its land and all its buildings were sold off. And 11 of them were bought by a man called Giles Geest, who was a wealthy silk mercer, and that's one of our reenactors portraying Giles Geest. And he bought 11 of the properties. And when he dies in 1558, what he does is he leaves those properties and a number of other ones. He sets up a charitable trust. So when people look at our buildings, they often think they look like typical almshouses, don't they? Well, they weren't almshouses that we think of for poor people to live in, but at one time, under the Giles Geest charity, 11 of the buildings in the row were used, the rental was used for charitable purposes. Described as shooting against the Walkay wall, and these are the Abbey Lawn cottages. The Walkay wall was the wall of Tewkesbury Abbey at the point running parallel with Church Street before turning to form the southwest side of Gander Lane. You can just see it there, obviously gone today. There's lots of theories about the name Walkay, but it could have come from the old Saxon word for fortification. But anyway, the wall formed the boundary between the town and the Abbey proper and the Abbey precincts. Few documents compare to the Giles Geest charity account book for a range of evidence related to the social, economic, political and cultural history of Tewkesbury over a span of almost 350 years. And you'll be pleased to know that you can actually buy the Giles Geest book. It's available from the County Record Office. And it's absolutely fascinating. I mean, for us, it's fascinating in that it records the rental from Giles Geest properties, obviously including our row of buildings. But its real strength lies in its marginalia. There's endless comments about national events. And just to give you an example, virtually all that we know about Tewkesbury during the English Civil War is thanks to Tewkesbury changing hands endlessly, is thanks to the Giles Geest account book. It's a very useful historical resource. Obviously, it's been transcribed, so you can read it properly, or you could have a go at reading. So, what happened to our row of buildings? Owned by the Giles Geest charity up until 1891. In 1784, 5 of the original cottages between 50 and 51, that's the old Royal British Legion building, and the Bell were demolished when the Gloucester Road became a turnpike. So we have lost some of the buildings in the row. On to 1935, many uses. Picture of Tewkesbury, Church Street in 1907. Got our lovely cottages there. Bell, obviously the house is long since gone there. There showing the National School, which dates, that building's about 1842, though the idea of a national school was much earlier, 1813, but originally set up in the Abbey. It had was Barsanti's Italian restaurant. That's one of my favourite pictures. That's number 40 next door to the museum, This is this wonderful Italian restaurant. Italian tea garden. So if you go around to the back of the museum today, obviously there's not an Italian tea garden anymore, but that's where the secret garden is today. So that's one of the more colourful uses of the houses in the row. 1935 to 1960, the Abbey Precincts Fund and the Abbey Lawn Trust. I titled this picture, What Might Have Been, because in 1935, Woolworths were very interested in buying the row of buildings that we're housed in now and knocking them down and building great big Woolworths. So if you can imagine that, no nice timber frame buildings, but a Woolworths store, maybe something similar to that. Fortunately, people were not very happy about it, and you have the great and the good. You have the Holland Martins at Overbury, and you have the Yorks at Forthampton. They get together and they form what's called the Abbey Precincts Fund. And the idea behind the Abbey Precincts Fund is, as you won't be surprised to know, is to preserve the precincts of Tewkesbury Abbey from unsuitable development. £5,000, they managed to persuade a wealthy American, Zula Woodhull Martin. They get her to buy Abbey Lawn House, and that forms the Abbey Lawn Trust, and the Abbey Precincts Fund and the Abbey Lawn Trust merge. So they buy that house to stop any unsuitable development. This is quite a nice picture because it shows just how the building abuts our current buildings. So that starts the ball rolling. Picture, that's the garden of Abbey Lawn House, now the Abbey Lawn. So these are the wonderful, that's where the lion gates are today. Back when the Abbey Lawn House was there, it was the garden of the house. Between 1940 and 1960s, the Abbey Lawn Trust start to buy the buildings in the row. And that's 1941 when number 40 comes up for sale. And that's a nice auction catalogue from the auction of September 25th, 1941, when the old Barsantes building. It's a nice description of all the different parts of it. The retail shop, the tea room, the bedrooms above. It also mentions, it's a bit out of focus there, mentions the gardens as well. So that building was purchased by the Abbey Lawn Trust in 1940. These are nice show pictures how the buildings were in the 1950s. So again, you've got Abbey Lawn House, abutting number 34. And you can see with these pictures as I move on just how the fronts have been altered from their original medieval look. You had this wonderful fashion in the 18th and 19th century for making your house to look modern by putting brick facades over. I think another reason for brick facades was sometimes to do with insurance. If your building had a brick facade, you were maybe more likely to get insurance. But see the jetty. The original jetty has disappeared because of the brick frontages that have been put out. So that's number 35 to number 36. Number 37 to 38, see that front is completely disguised, covered in brick. That's one of the reasons that people didn't realise just how old these buildings were. Because 39, showing where the ex-Aurora pub was and the Aurora Passage, and again, brick facades. Abbey Tower, that's quite a nice picture because it shows the rear of the cottages circa 1950. So you've got all these wonderful open plan gardens there, and note the plethora of outbuildings, lots of brick outbuildings have been added, and all sorts of businesses carried on there. There was a rope maker, for example, so. But they'd really heavily altered the back of the buildings. To 1967, disrepair and possible demolition. 1964, Abbey Lawn House is demolished. It had been requisitioned by the MOD in the Second World War. It was first used for evacuees, then as a convalescent home. And by the time the Abbey Lawn Trust got the house given back to them, it was in such a bad state of disrepair that they were given £3,000 in compensation. But it was terribly infested with dry rot. And in 1964, the building was demolished, which was sad, but also a good thing for the later preservation. Row with Abbey Lawn House now gone. But you can see just what the state of the buildings were like by the mid-1960s. They got into quite a bad state of disrepair, because what had happened is that the Abbey Lawn Trust, though they'd had enough money to buy the buildings, they didn't have enough money to actually do anything with them. So over time, the buildings gradually started to decay, and as people moved out, they were left empty, and of course that doesn't do a building any good at all. And the theory was that possibly they might be compulsorily purchased by the local authority and then maybe demolished. There was the thought of demolishing this row of buildings and having a nice grassy facade in front of the Abbey, which would have been quite nice. The other idea was that possibly they might knock down most of the buildings, but keep a couple of the better examples, then move them closer to the Abbey to have a kind of, I don't know, open-air kind of theme park, which is quite interesting. See, looking very sad by 1967. This end of the row of buildings was far worse than the upper half. Number 36, not looking very happy at all. Bottom 37 to 39, you can see, you know, really derelict. Number 38. Number 40, that's good old Barsantes. After the Second World War, it was used as a garden shop by the Overbury estate, but then obviously by now abandoned. And Barsantes, number 36. This is interesting for me. This is the rear of 4041, now the John Moore Museum. So if you come around the John Moore Museum, that's our garden now, which looks a lot nicer, hopefully. To 48. Possibly thinking of having the buildings pulled down, possibly thinking of creating a kind of open-air museum. 1967 was when the Victoria County History for Gloucestershire was being compiled, and a man called Stanley Jenkins, an architect, he came around and looked at this row of buildings, and he actually had the foresight and the skill to look at them and realise that they were far more interesting than all these brick facades might lead you to believe. They thought they might just be, you know, grade 2 star listed, but he realised just how important they were as a medieval survival, as a medieval terrace. Led from 1967 to 73 to their preservation, conservation, and restoration. In 1967, the local authority decided to widen Gander Lane. Should we see that? That opportunity to enlarge the Abbey lawn and to make a car park from the old kitchen garden of Abbey Lawn House. So that's Gander Lane, the car park taking shape. We've got lots of historical records to do with these buildings, you won't be surprised to know. But there's reams and reams of correspondence about this wretched car park, about what kind of tarmac you can lay and what kind of bollards you can have. So it's interesting, sort of local authority mind, really, about these lovely timber frame buildings, but the car park. The Lawn Trust decide to do up St Mary's Cottage. St Mary's Cottage there, which is a wing of the old demolished Abbey Lawn House. So they restore that building. All agree today it looks really a lot nicer. nearly complete. St Mary's Cottage improved. So, the rather ominously entitled Phase 1. In 1967, the fate of these buildings comes to the attention of the Society for the Preservation of Ancient Buildings. And the architect Jeremy Benson, shown on the right, comes up with a scheme costed at £60,000, which in today's money is about £800,000. A restoration scheme to give the buildings a new lease of life and not just to protect the Abbey precincts. So his preservation scheme actually shows the trustees that these buildings have a use. The use not just a nice facade in front of the Abbey, but can actually be used. So finally begins in February 1968 with the removal of the many outbuildings. I particularly like this picture showing the outbuildings removed because it shows a simpler age, an age before health and safety. You've literally got these guys on the roof, no hard hats, no high-vis jackets, you know, just happily hammering and pickaxing away with the trustees and the architect just below. Something that wouldn't happen today. I should just say that the restoration of these buildings wasn't universally approved of. There was lots of, when the restoration scheme was being funded, there were lots of letters in the local papers. Lots of people objected to their restoration, saying, well, you know, there's no shortage of timber frame buildings in Tewkesbury, and they're a bit of an eyesore anyway, and wouldn't it be nice to have a grassy sward in front of the Abbey? And also, if you restore these buildings too much, you know, you're altering them too much, you might be destroying the very history. So it wasn't universally popular. There was a group of ladies called the Tewkesbury 12, I think they were. They were from Tewkesbury Grammar School, and they wrote lots of letters complaining about the restoration of the buildings. But anyway, the restoration began in February 1968. Was a service road which made possible the demolition, which was made possible because of the demolition of Abbey Lawn House. Because if you can cast your minds back, Abbey Lawn House was here. And of course, the demolition of Abbey Lawn House made it possible to save these buildings. So one of the first things they did was they built a service road, because as we all know, I mean, the A38 is a busy road today, but this was just when the motorway was being built. So it would be almost impossible to do the restoration work from the front. So they had to build a service road at the back. Restoration in progress. Obviously, the buildings had to be taken back to their original timber framing structures to strengthen them and make them safe for 20th century living. Nice one, more eagle-eyed of you, you can actually see, you can see through the buildings across the road. That's the Abbey Hotel just there. These pictures belong to Jeremy, were donated to us by Jeremy Benson. So that's the rear of number 40, previously Barsantes. That's by about 1970, that's a bit low. 41, 43, and that's the John Moore Museum today. Another close-up there with seeing right through the buildings. A lot of them, as you can imagine, a lot of the original infill material, the watland daub, that couldn't be saved. But where it did exist, they tried to keep it in situ. And if you go to the John Moore Museum, we've got a section of it in our wall. So that's 43 to 44 stripped back. So by the end of 1968, many of the buildings had been reduced to nothing more than shelves, which was allowing the main restoration work to begin. Trustees looking around, again, in the days before health and safety, just wandering around the building site. That's the front of the buildings with the brick facades being removed. A close up there. It's the rear of 35 to 37, that's at the end of the row. Another close-up. Museum again in the centre, that's looking, for those of you that have visited and know the museum, starting to emerge the building. Again, the back of the museum. So after the buildings had all been stripped back to their timber framing and the outside repaired, that's when we got onto the interiors. Now, one of the very sad things about the restoration, they took endless pictures of the outside of the buildings, both before and during restoration, but hardly any photographs exist showing you the interiors, which is very, very sad, really, because it's been a fascinating social history archive. This is the interior of one of the rare photographs of the interior of number 39, showing this nice Jacobean staircase. But so they just didn't record the interiors at all. We've known lots of people who've lived in the row of buildings, and they don't have photographs either, which is annoying. That's the restoration from the Abbey Tower. That's circa 1970s. That's a good picture because it shows you what they were doing in that they were working from either end and meeting in the middle. So there we have the John Wall Museum there. There we have the Merchant's House. Now the Merchant's House is interesting because when the buildings were restored, the whole idea was to give them a use today. So they were restored and refurbished so that people could live in them. And the great thing about having people living in them is they're your tenants. So we have commercial and residential tenants who are all paying rental. But it was thought important to preserve some of the architectural history of the building. So number 45 there, the Merchant's House, was found to have the most original features. So it was restored back to give you an idea of what a medieval merchant shop and house would have looked like. So the chimney was removed, and when you visit it today, it will give you an idea of the original structure and layout. That's a close-up there, about the same period. You might be able to spot just there's a person, because hard to believe, during all the restoration work, most of the tenants had gone, but there was one lady called Mrs. Pemberton who refused to move during the restoration of the buildings. So she was in situ, and I believe she lived in 2 or 3 of them. As they restored buildings, they moved her up and down the row. And there's Mrs. Pemberton there, living literally on a building site. Again, something you can't imagine ever happening today. But Mrs. Pemberton was still alive in 95, 96 or so. Fascinating. The row of buildings nearly complete. Merchant's House there. You see the jetty. The jetty has emerged, gone into the brick facade. Though next door to the museum, you have number 40. That was the Georgian facade there was left because that's a sort of architectural interest in itself. But if you go around the back, you can see the original medieval timber frame structure. Pretty much almost complete there. Merchant's House, and that's where Mrs. Pemberton ended up. Originally, Mrs. Pemberton shared her garden with the Merchant's House garden. So if you visited the museum, you could have a chat with Mrs. Pemberton, as well as seeing the building. In 1971, Tewkesbury won an award for outstanding enterprise during European Conservation Year, and the Abbey lawn cottages were cited by the judges as a matter deserving highest praise. In April 1971, you have the royal visit of Tewkesbury to Tewkesbury by the Queen, and there are some of the workmen lining up outside the John Wall Museum waiting to meet her. green, that's the back of number 40 coming out of Barsantes, and there, as was, and the man on the left, that's Jeremy Benson showing her around. So really nice for, not only for Jeremy Benson, but for the trustees to have this acknowledgement. 50-51, the Mason's Arms as was, the Royal British Legion as was, but which was not restored. It was not part of the restoration process. I'll just finish off with just a little tour. The Merchant's House, just after restoration. If you think back to those nice old woodcuts, there you've got the shop facing the street. Very sadly, with having pavements and having a busy road, the shutter counter mechanism couldn't have been put back. But if Tewkesbury Church Street is ever, I can't imagine it will happen, if it's ever pedestrianised, perhaps you could have these shutter counter mechanisms installed because it would look really good. So very small shop frontage. The front of the building is recreated as a merchant's shop and house, interpretation. Funny little chap there is for our audio guides. The back, with the very steep stairs. Room upstairs. The building is recreated to show a Tudor merchant shop and house rather than a medieval merchant shop and house. And that's purely because the Tudors at one time were quite big on the national curriculum. So it was very useful for schools. The Merchant's House was opened in about 1973 when the restoration was complete. The John Moore Museum didn't actually open until 1970. You don't know, was a Gloucestershire writer. He wrote about the countryside and conservation, but he also wrote about the importance of preserving Tewkesbury's built heritage. And he was very keen that built heritage was preserved so it had a use today. So he died in 1967, and the trustees thought it would be very nice to have a building as a memorial to him. So he would have been delighted that the buildings were saved, but they also had John Moore there. Garden. About what really John Moore was interested in. So it's really more about sort of natural history and the countryside, John Moore's concerns, obviously. That's a natural history tax. I just thought it might be interesting just to show you a typical Abbey Lawn cottage today, because people are always interested in what the houses are like inside today. And of course, today we do record what the houses are like. Number 44, when it was vacant in 2013, nipped in with my camera. So that's your back, that's your living room. Interestingly, when they restored the buildings, they changed them all around. Because prior to restoration, the living rooms at the front of the building, facing the busy Church Street, when they restored the buildings, they swapped them all around, so the living rooms at the back, which is fantastic really now, because Church Street is so noisy. I felt, quite sorry for people who must have lived there, in the 1960s or so, before the motorway, busy road, lead petrol, lead fumes pouring in. It can't have been very pleasant. So now the living rooms are at the back of the houses. From the other end, basic kitchen. It's since 2013, the kitchen has been modernised. There's beautiful views out from the bedroom, looking out over the Abbey and the glamorous Lee there in Bath. I'd be interested in other Abbey Lawn Trust holdings, because the Abbey Lawn Trust don't just own. So, for those of you who are dog walkers, that's that tithe barn there. In fact, the Abbey Gatehouse belongs to the Abbey Lawn Trust. It's leased to the Landmark Trust, who use it as holiday lets, but it is actually owned by the Abbey Lawn Trust. Just around the corner, so you can't see it, the very beautiful monastery cottage, which is just tucked around the corner. Again, rented out. Rental's so important to the trust. I mean, having spent all that money on restoring the buildings, they're now self-sustaining. So all the rental from residential and commercial is all ploughed back into the preservation of the buildings. And also, if you think back to having a car park is a very good money spinner. So just finally, this shows you all the different Abbey Lawn Trust holdings. So you've got the row of buildings there, got the garden, as was, of Abbey Lawn House. A lot of people think this is all owned by the Abbey, but in fact it's part of the Abbey Lawn Trust, all looked after by Andy, our gardener, and there's the Abbey Meadow also. So the Abbey Lawn Trust, you know, in theory, could continue to add to its holdings. The old Baptist chapel that John referred to earlier, that is still owned by the Baptist Church. So I'm not really going to talk about that today, but that is leased to us for 60 years or so. So yeah, that's a rough picture of what the Abbey Lawn Trust has done, a brief history of our row of buildings, but the best way to experience them really is to actually visit them, which I hope you all will.
Thank you, Simon.
That's a pleasure. Oh, sorry, yeah.
Oh, hello.
Yeah, that's
Yes, I just wanted to know where the timbers come from.
Well, that's
I thought Forest of Dean, but there.
Well, we always thought they were local, but when the dendrochronology project went on, it was discovered that a lot of the timbers actually originate from Shropshire. So we think possibly the Benedictine monks, you know, they owned land everywhere, that these were some of their land holdings in Shropshire. So maybe the timbers were perhaps brought to Tewkesbury down the River Severn, because the great thing with a, say, timber frame building, as I said earlier, they're prefabricated. So they wouldn't have been bringing the great big pieces of wood to work on that had been made off-site and then have been brought in almost like a kit form. So, yeah, we can't prove this, but I mean, so that a lot of them aren't local timbers. So.
So what did you make the modern wattle and daub with?
What do you make? Well, it depends on who you're actually using. We just tend to keep the original wattle and daub.
You kept it?
Yeah, where possible, we've kept it. Right. We haven't replaced it.
Yeah, because you can see that in your museum, can't
yes, you can see the original, but where the later infill material has been used. In fact, in some places in the buildings, some concrete blocks are put in, which you wouldn't be allowed to do today, but it was a different world in the 1960s or so.
Right. Yes. It's on.
Yeah. As a schoolgirl, I remember cycling round the end of that by the Abbey lawn. Yes. And seeing those buildings. But I was always saddened that opposite there are some almshouses that were so picturesque, and in the 1960s they're demolished, and they're still almshouses. I don't know if you know where I'm.
Do you mean the ones opposite the car park in Gander Lane?
Yes, and there's a plaque on them saying an old plaque that was rescued from the buildings, I suppose. But I always thought, what a shame that wasn't within the Abbey Lawn Trust, and they could have been saved or restored.
It would have been a pity. Talking actually of almshouses, you know you have the Russell almshouses. They're that row of buildings by the Abbey. That line. At one time, there was a theory that the Abbey Lawn Trust might purchase the Russell almshouses, knock them down, move the residents into this row of buildings after they were restored. Because the Russell almshouses do tend to block the view of the Abbey a little bit. But that was one of the things that never happened, thank goodness.
Good, yeah. You were outside to ask questions. Yes, indeed.
I was just going to ask you, when the restoration has been done, did you find any wells in the back gardens?
Yeah, there were some wells, and some of the buildings actually had cellars, but they were all filled in. I mean, there was a butchered ox, which we think might be from medieval times, was found out. Obviously, lots of pottery and things. And
you found an ox?
A butchered ox. An ox, the skeleton of an ox that had been butchered.
Where is it today?
It's in the museum. We've got it in store.
Another exciting thing to go and see.
And also a nice Bellarmine jar, quite a big one as well, which was good. But the thing with these buildings, they've been used so much, like Chutesy Battlefield, trodden over by so many people, there's virtually nothing, left. People reuse stuff until it fell apart.
Like the Abbey doesn't flood. I mean, I know that the crypt flooded in 2007, but the buildings were built above the flood level.
The only things that flooded in 2007 as far as our buildings, some of the cellars flooded and had to be pumped out. But we were on that little island, really, which just goes to show, well, if you're going to buy a property in an old town, buy it in the oldest part, because they knew what they were doing.
You mentioned that they sold almost the first house to be bought by it was
Abbey Lawn
1941 or sometime.
Not Abbey Lawn House, yes, 1940, I think.
And how much was it? Did they get it for?
It was £5,000 they bought it for. Which I think is 100. I think it converts to about 143,000 in modern terms.
I suppose, of course, it was right at the beginning of the war, so it would have been depressed the prices anyway, wouldn't it?
Yes. Because it's called Abbey Lawn House. It's called the Brown House, wasn't it, as well?
Yeah, but it was owned by it also called the Town Clerk's House, wasn't it? Because it was Brown, who was the town clerk in the early 20th century. Yeah, it's a shame we haven't got one of our members who doesn't come to meetings now because of age and things. Ella Perry comes here, and she used to live in the Abbey Lawn House after the war, when it was used, for housing situation. And I think it was quite horrific living there. There was, I think other people talk about the vegetation that was growing through the floors where people were still living there. It was quite horrendous. I think it's the Americans that are to blame for that.
Interesting, about 10 years ago, we did an oral history project, and we managed to track down some people who'd lived in the buildings in the 1950s, 40s or so. And, there was no hot water, and there were outside loos, but there was a massive community spirit. Everyone talked really fondly about these buildings. In fact, one of the reenactors who comes to us today, Nigel Packwood, when he remembers when the buildings were restored, running around the building site and things, because his relations lived in the row of buildings. But yeah, we've got a nice history of recordings. So we don't know, we haven't got any pictures of what the buildings were like, but we've got a kind of oral, sort of audio picture of what they were like.
Yeah, Barbara Key, who's still with us, she lived there as a child.
Yeah, you covered two things there, Simon. When I did the book of Dave Wathen, I've got some oral history from him because obviously he lived in the row.
Yeah.
And also, when you talked about the Watling Daub, we had timber frame Watling Daub at 75 Barton Street.
Did you?
Yeah, there's still some there. And the other thing that has really fascinated me tonight is the photos in the 60s of what the properties were like. Now, I've got no idea, no reminiscence of any of those properties. I mean, I was 12, 14, 16. And when we did the book with Dave, I took a photo, obviously, of his, I'm not sure whether it was 37, I can't remember now. So I took a photograph of what it was, and I just thought that that's what it looked like when he was there.
Yes.
So I had no idea of the brick front, so
no.
Yeah, fascinating.
Yeah, people didn't, because of those, people just didn't realise how important they were. I think
that's right.
That's why people were saying, oh, don't bother to save them.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Brilliant photos, thank you.
Pleasure.
Do people still want to live there, and does it make enough money, rents and things?
Yeah, people still want to live in the buildings because I mean they have an awful lot of character. They're a bit cold, they're a bit drafty, and you know you just think today with the rising cost of fuel, they're quite expensive to heat, but they have a lot of character. So some of the bigger ones in the row that are used for commercial purposes, they can be trickier to rent out. But for example, the house at the bottom now is worked in by a team of architects who work with listed buildings, so they like the setting to work in. But yeah, that's interesting.
I've been told, and is it correct, that part of the tenancy is if somebody knocks on the door, they've got to show you around. Is that not true? Oh.
Well, I've not heard that.
Right, we'll all try that then.
Yeah, though our neighbours are very, 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 very happy to talk about the buildings, and yeah, they could do teas, couldn't they? It'd be very, very popular.
Anybody else would like to join in? Hang on, we've got to talk loudly about the Queen.
It was only to say that the lady that was still living there hoped she met the Queen.
You'd like to hope so, wouldn't you?
I hope so.
We certainly interviewed one of the builders who restored the buildings. He sadly now died, and he remembers what a day it was. Yeah. You know, all this hard work, and they felt sort of a real vindication for all that effort. In the royal visit. Thank you.
Yes, it's quite a triumph, wasn't it, to get all the work done in time for her coming, because she had to come on that date.
Yes.
Yeah. Good. Right, okay. Simon, that was terrific. We waited too long to hear this, and that's really good. You didn't tell me why the Abbey garage.
Oh, yeah.
You were going to tell me why that wasn't restored, or they changed, didn't they? That's next door to the...
The Abbey garage, they just stripped back the brick and they just replaced it with, well, in the old timber framing emerged underneath. Yeah. But they kept, interestingly, they kept the Georgian facade of number 40, which you can still see today, the old Barsantes.
Right, okay, good. Right, well, yes, it was, yeah, I'm so pleased you come along to tell us this story, because it is a triumph, I think, of looking forward and making sure that even the Abbey didn't get its way to have the buildings demolished, to give a better view, and also Woolworths didn't come, and we've got this wonderful line of houses today. So thank you ever so much, Simon.
That's a pleasure, John. Absolute pleasure.
Good, thank you very much. Can we give a applause to Simon? Thank you. And the technology didn't let you down, did it?
Well, I've got repetitive
well done, you two up there. Good. Right, will you all please stay now for coffee, tea? We have no rules today. You're all triple jabbed, even